Just okay. Might.
No, you didn't send it.
Yeah, now I'm wondering where it went. I might have left it on the Zoom website. Okay, I'll try to figure that out later today. Well, so any
Good
lingering
morning.
questions then from last week? No lingering questions. Okay. Well, we've sort of spent a few weeks on this, getting this idea. So now we're going to shift gears with Hick. I found a couple of videos, but last minute, so I haven't been able to. I didn't totally preview them, but they look good so far. So we'll see. One sort of discusses it, and the other has criticisms of Hick's system. All right, let's see if we can start with that. So share screen. Go away. And here we are. Okay.
Okay, so today we're going to look at Hick's theodicy. So this is a much more modern idea from the theologian John Hick, who was a 20th century theologian. His idea was fundamentally this. It was the evil or pain, really, I put it in its kind of non-moral context, provides us with an opportunity, for good choices, for moral development.
And right, that's the key idea, right? Development.
Look, if you imagine a world without any pain and suffering, then that is a world that he calls morally static. It is a kind of zombie world in which nothing important ever occurs. His inspiration was St. Irenaeus, who knew pain and suffering extremely well. It's sometimes kind of convenient for us to think of these theologians as in some way separate from the world, but whilst those like, say, John Hick, lived in the 20th century,
Hick died in 2012.
Theologians we look at didn't live in a time where it was comfortable to be a Christian. Augustine, for instance, in Hippo, lived in a time when bishops were attacked with acid and taken from their houses by mobs and forced with whips to turn grist mills. St. Irenaeus lived in a time when Christians were persecuted. He claims to have known some of the original saints. He claims to have known those who had actually seen and witnessed Jesus and then later been executed. Irenaeus had a rather different interpretation of the Bible compared to those like Augustine, though. He took this claim in Genesis, which says that then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." Now, the interpretation here, in fact, John Hick acknowledges the interpretation here is interesting, but Irenaeus says what this means is that God created man, first of all, in his image, so like God, a bit, an inspiration from God, but not very good. And then we hope that he becomes in the likeness of God. He improves over time. And this improvement from just the image all the way up to the likeness occurs for Irenaeus through the experience and the response to pain. So John Hick takes this and kind of runs with it. His essential point, okay, so I'm going to do something slightly different here, by the way. I'm going to give you a kind of pictorial understanding over here, and then we'll write some notes over here. So his essential idea is that human freedom and moral development come out of an experience of evil. His first idea is this. It's called epistemic distance. So epistemic distance is defined as us not knowing about God. Why is it that God wouldn't just come in and cure someone who has cancer or save a murder victim or whatever? Well, if he did, if he was all present as he is here, well, then those of us on Earth would know about him, he thinks. And that actually creates a big problem. What we want is some form of a distinction, a gap between.
I think it's worth sort of noticing here that if people actually had direct evidence of a God, that would be very different than the situation we find ourselves in, where people have a desire, and this is sort of one of the things Hicks talks about sort of in the beginning of his essay, is that he starts with the assumption that people have already, let's see, what is his exact language here? The Odyssey Project starts at this point with an already operating belief in God embodied in human living. But if that belief had really obvious evidence to back it up, then this problem of evil would really work very differently. I mean, you'd still have sort of the basic outlines of it if you had the construct, right? Well, so God's good and powerful and knows what's going on. Why would God allow evil? And in the context of not really being sure there is a God, because you don't have obvious proof, then it's easier to ask questions. So the doubt becomes much more pronounced, much more obvious, much more prevalent, because you don't have this obvious thing to point at, this obvious evidence to point at. So you have to have a problem of not knowing for sure what's going on for any of this to make any kind of sense. Because if people knew what was going on, then they just have to navigate, what does it mean that they know exactly what's going on? And I think that's kind of an interesting part of the problem to keep in mind about how to navigate it, is that you're operating with a goal that you want, but it's uncertain, and the evidence to demonstrate it is being undermined by the problem you're trying to solve. So you need to solve that problem, so you do away with that challenge. But fundamentally, the bigger problem is you have your own epistemic problem, this knowledge problem of not really knowing for sure what's going on in the world. Anyway, just an important little wrinkle in how the argument is going to be necessarily built
between us and God, so that we don't feel we're always being watched. And this, he thinks, leads to genuine freedom, a genuine ability to choose, to make substantive choices. So Hick thinks that humans are genuinely free to choose, that epistemic distance.
Now, I guess also keep in mind too, this is going to be different than the way that some of the other theologians are talking about, because they're going to want to emphasize omnipresence and omniscience more. That it's, especially the process people, it's very important to the process people that God's always there, always knows, that God has no epistemic distance, but we might. So in Hick's version, the epistemic problem remember epistemology, epistemic, fancy Latin words for knowledge. The knowledge problems goes both ways for Hick. And that's part of how the system works. It's important that the knowledge problem is working both ways. But for some of the others, it's going to be very important. The knowledge problem is only one direction and not both directions. So it's curious. So like Roth, he's already started off with some really unusual kind of ideas in terms of what standard theological constructs have been in the past. So Hick also in this sense is a little postmodern. You know, he's playing a little fast and loose because he's going to argue that, well, we don't have this certainty, therefore I can play a little fast and loose with some of these things. He does that with these scriptural citations too, like Irenaeus. You know, he's going to acknowledge this is really kind of an extreme reading. You're really working your interpretation to get that idea out of this language. And other times he's going to want to try to be much more literal, and so he'll bounce between that. I'm going to be very expansive in my interpretation, or I'm going to try to be very literal in my interpretation when it works for me. Okay, so yeah, just to keep an eye on that. He is being a little squirrely with some of these ideas. What happened?
Allows us to choose, allows us
and what let me do
to choose, and therefore
That's
also
not
be
helpful.
responsible for our choices. If you imagine that, say, the government was very, very actively and obviously watching you, let's say it literally put a policeman in every home, well, then you would feel constrained, wouldn't you? And if God were literally just there watching, then you wouldn't feel like you could ever act. So by
here and again, whoop, oh,
the
that's,
world, God allows us.
and again, keep in mind the construct of this infinite kind of idea, the infinite knowledge, infinite power. When Irenaeus is originally coming up with this idea of his, this kind of soul making is what it's the shorthand for it. When Irenaeus is coming up with this, they didn't have that infinity concept. That's not operational. So for Irenaeus, it's not a particularly strange idea that God is not always watching, because people like to make modern interpretations of it. But you think about the story in Genesis, when Adam and Eve first taste the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they hide from God, and God shows up in the garden and calls out, "Where are you?" And when you get into modern thinking and in this infinity of knowledge, that just seems like an obviously odd thing for God to do, because of course God would know exactly where they are in the garden. Why would God be calling to try and find them? But it's because when that story was written, they didn't have this idea about an infinite capacity for God to have knowledge. So therefore, it was quite obvious to them that you could hide from God. God would have to go and find you someplace, because God just couldn't see you everywhere. God would have to do something to see you, manifest something somehow to see you. So anyway, so it's sometimes a little interesting how the modern thinkers just sort of read their own version of the ideas into the past. And so it doesn't seem to come up in the way Hick talks about it, that obviously he's at 2,000 years distance from Irenaeus, and so he's going to think differently about the world. But that's kind of an important detail about this knowledge problem.
To make genuine choices. But these choices aren't significant if it's just about epistemic distance. They don't really matter. We need something else too, and that is where pain comes in. Pain is what Hick calls an instrumental good. It allows these choices to be significant in nature. So it allows us to cause pain in others and also to react to pain itself. So an instrumental good is something that is teleological. So if you've studied ethics, you'll know that teleological is all about the end result. It is teleological in that the thing in itself may not be positive, but the result is positive.
Is from the Greek. Telos is the Greek word for end, so oriented towards an end or a goal.
So it's a good outcome. So why is pain an instrumental good? Well, as the author C.S. Lewis once put it, yes, the author of the Narnia books, but also a popular theologian, he put it in his book on the problem of evil called The Problem of Pain. He said, pain provides the opportunity for heroism. The opportunity is seized with surprising frequency. Hick thinks that paradise, a place without pain, would lead to what he calls a state of kind of moral stasis. A world, he says, a world without problems, difficulties, perils, and hardships would be morally static. In other words, no real choice. Pain allows us to respond meaningfully. In other words, it allows us to grow as individuals. Now, it's actually really important to notice that this is not kind of a species-wide thing. This is instead an individual thing. As Hick writes, he says that man is in process of becoming the perfected being, much like Irenaeus's idea of coming into the likeness of God, whom God is seeking to create. So God wants us to be perfect, but he can't just create us perfect. However, this is not taking place, it is important to add, by a natural and inevitable evolution. It isn't inevitable that it will happen, but through a hazardous adventure in individual freedom. As individuals, we grow into perfection, hopefully. He calls the world that does this a...
Did I hear a question?
Well, it makes me upset. Can you hear me? Oh.
Yeah. Go ahead. Say more.
Because all this nonsense about pain, I so happen to have a daughter who's an art therapist in a children's hospital. And if he were to see what pain does, you would ask, where is this God that you talk about? It's absolutely astonishing. And actually, it just makes me mad, makes me very angry that this man can talk about pain this way. There are also people in that hospital who say to the children, you are evil. And that's because of this kind of thinking.
Well, like I think I mentioned, that's right. That's the problem of scale. The scale just seems out of whack with what's being achieved, and that's sort of a perfect example of how that scale problem works. And that's going to be one of the major critiques of this kind of thinking. The other to keep in mind is why couldn't God just create people to be perfect? Like what? Right. It's just sort of asserted as a fact, like we're supposed to accept that. Okay, let's see. Janet has a virtual hand. Let's go with that first.
Okay. Yes, so that's the point I wanted to clarify. So Hick was saying that humans were intentionally created imperfect. Is that correct?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But also for some reason had to be. That's which is actually that's a weakness in the claim. Like why do they have to be?
Okay. I just wanted to make sure I understood that. Thank you.
No problem. Okay. Whoops. Now let's see. I know there's another hand in here. I saw someone raising. Oh, there we go. Yeah, Marcia.
He didn't make me furious, but I don't agree with what he's saying. The prisoners in Auschwitz were in terrible pain, both emotional and physical. And there was almost no opportunity for them to have any kind of spiritual or emotional
Right.
growth. Even later, even for the rest of their lives, they were just permanently damaged.
Mhm.
Yeah, and again, that's the scale problem coming back. Now the part too that and I share I have the same kind of emotional reactions to this sort of stuff too. So I can identify with those responses because I also find it frustrating on that level. But and what it's not Irenaeus didn't know about that kind of thing. But Hick does, he lived in the latter half of the 20th century. He knows what happened in the 20th century and still wants to make this argument. Now, the thing to keep in mind, I guess in his defense, is even people who survived the Holocaust, some of them, after the fact, would refer to this kind of idea. And that somehow that mattered to them. And some of, because some of them just gave up, right? They just like, this makes no sense at all. I'm not going to believe in God anymore. So it seems like an obvious logical response to that kind of problem. But some of them, they go through that kind of experience and they still have this belief. And then if they're going to talk about why, well, they need to say something. And some of them will reference these kinds of ideas. So it is still the case that even the people we want to sympathize most in the story we're going to tell about it, some of them go and they accept this way of thinking, even though it seems very extreme, sort of from our distance to it. So that's sort of that's really the only thing I can say to help you with that emotional management of the response, is because I have the same response, but I just try to keep in mind other people really find this to be helpful in some ways. And that's true about all of these theodicies. They all exist because people they want some answer, and then there are these different ways of trying to give them an answer. And these are the ways that have worked over time, that these ideas keep getting talked about because some people find them reassuring in some ways. But again, I'm definitely one of the people who doesn't find it reassuring.
Richard?
Yeah.
If you give up on the thought that God is omnipotent, then you don't have to do all this fancy footwork to have there still be a God.
Yeah, and that's what the process people do. Yeah, exactly. That's their move so it's and you'll see there are other problems people have with that move, but in some way it was a gentle move in some ways, and so it solves that problem, even if it may raise other problems for people that they just find the idea of a God has very very little power kind of meaningless, which is we'll talk about that when we get to process.
Richard, one more comment, please.
Yeah.
Am I wrong to see a little bit of a parallel to what this idea of pain allows us to respond meaningfully with Buddhist tradition, like substitute the term suffering for pain, and then the idea the Buddha in the traditional story grew up in a palace, kind of protected from all experience of evil. But then it was really crucial for him to be exposed to that and go through that in order to grow or reach whatever, in their terminology, reach enlightenment. Is that
I think
how you think?
I think it does, and Hick is probably aware of that, where Irenaeus wouldn't have been aware of that connection. But I think, yeah, in terms of the structure of the thinking, it has similar relation. There's similar tracking going on. The difference, of course, the Buddhists don't have a creator to be responsible, so you don't get this. You don't get the problem.
I just meant the idea of the role
It's
of
suffering.
Hick,
Yeah, that suffering is
in
important.
growth.
Yeah, definitely is connect. There's definitely a relationship there, a similarity there. Yeah. Okay, Janet. Did you?
Yeah, just this epistemic distance. Is that related to the idea of God not being omniscient?
Well, it's yes. So what you end up with is he's giving up omniscience.
Okay. So that's just one little piece of the whole picture, but okay, thank you.
Well, right, and he doesn't, giving up omniscience doesn't really solve the problem of evil, though. That's the important bit. He has to do more work, because God would have to be ignorant for that to be workable as a solution. But what he's getting at is just that God isn't monitoring everything in detail all the time. But God would certainly be aware of things happening, like wars and mass suffering like that. Could drop in on the hospital, you'd think, and pay attention at a moment. And no details, but from the ordinary point of view, isn't tracking all of those details all the time.
Okay.
So it's not ignorance, but it's just not complete knowledge. That's
so now it's a scale issue. But
yeah.
Okay, but I guess, well, maybe we can come back to this after the visit. This idea that distance gets us to free will, it seems a little tenuous too. So that's what I'm struggling with, is really the free will, how the free will fits in with the not monitoring every detail.
Well, it doesn't. Okay, so it's not really free will that it's solving. It's more. It's a more kind of mundane idea, like the guy was trying to illustrate with, if there's a policeman in your house all the time, you're going to behave differently. So if you know that someone's watching you all the time, you're going to behave differently. So Hick's God is not watching us all the time, but that doesn't mean God doesn't notice things that happen. It just means day to day, moment to moment, God's not watching you, and so therefore you're kind of free to be whoever you're really going to be. And that's part of the test of what's going on, is who are you really if no one's watching you?
But I have another question then with this. I thought the emphasis was really more on that, as I says in this book here, that God is not in evidence. And so God's purpose for the world must not be evident. And within that mystery, we then function to figure it out. So it says more about humans not being able to ever have proof or have clear evidence of God, doesn't it?
Well, it's a distance both directions.
Both directions, okay.
Yeah. So all of these thinkers will have the human direction problem, that humans are uncertain, don't have certain knowledge. But most of them are going to have God having knowledge, certain knowledge. Hick is this, the Irenaean approach is what makes it different, is that it doesn't have this omniscient knowledge. It just has more ordinary knowledge.
So up where the definitions are, then it's us not knowing about God, and God's a big picture God, not a little detail God.
Yeah, in some ways. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, here we go.
Veil of soul making. It's a quote from a John Keats poem, which goes like this. It says, Call the world, if you please, the veil of soul making, then you will find out the use of the world. There may be intelligences or sparks of the divinity in millions, but they are not souls till they acquire identities, till each one is personally itself. I apologize, I think that was actually, that's a letter, isn't it? It wasn't a poem. Anyway, this veil of soul making, this thing, sorry, I just knocked the mic. I was doing so well up until that point, and then it all went wrong. Anyway, so this veil of soul making allows us to improve, but of course not all of us are going to improve. Some of us are still going to choose pretty bad actions. So this leads us on to our final point, which is universal salvation. In other words, everyone that deserves to goes to heaven, and those who don't go to hell. But hell is not a negative place like it is in traditional Christian thinking. Instead, hell is another veil of soul making. It's another chance, he thinks, for us to improve ourselves and then gain admittance to heaven. So that's Hick's theodicy, Hick's view of God and how he might or would allow evil into the world.
Good. Hold on a second here. See what's going on. Oh, okay, good. He's just rolling right into the second one.
Hey, come take a look at this. If you have a utility meter like this on the side of your house, we are looking for.
Okay, so here he'll get at problems. Let me go back to share.
So today we're going to look at John Hick's theodicy and specifically criticisms of it. I think it might be worth us just having a quick little recap, looking at the main points that Hick has made. He starts with the concept of pain itself, and Hick calls this pain an instrumental good. So remember,
But I guess I do want to emphasize sort of this point about so the universal salvation. So okay, so the whole question of sort of what happens to people after they die has received a number of answers in our history, because it starts with this ancient Hebrew concept that's called Sheol. It's sort of the underworld, and for them, they're working with the same. I think it's sort of the same kind of intuition that the animists have. That, well, things have their own spirits, and so those spirits are responsible for animating them, and therefore they're going to be different than things in ordinary life. And so when something dies, the thing that animated it must be going away. And where would that go? So must be somewhere. So Sheol becomes this sort of placeholder conceptually. It's like, well, they have to go somewhere, so that must be where they go. And that eventually, evolves in well, I mean, then there is this obvious concept they have of heaven right along the way. So heaven is originally really is literally up in the sky. And so they know that the system of belief holds that there are these godly sorts of creatures, God and angels, but right, angels are not what they mean later on. Angels are warriors of a kind in this version of thought. So in the ancient world, so you have this heavenly court, as it were, God and God's hosts. So there is this sense, those are different places, but Sheol isn't quite as important or meaningful in that construct. It really matters that heavenly construct is vitally important, and so we'll eventually get some mystics who want to try and go and visit it. And that's, so the first one is in Daniel, the book of Daniel in the Hebrew Bible. And Daniel has this ascension, and he goes up to heaven and sees God in God's chariot. So there's this kind of, that idea introduces kind of the logical possibility that, well, maybe if someone died, that spirit of theirs, or soul in a more modern language, didn't just go to Sheol and hang out, become sort of drift off into nothingness, but what if they went up to God? And so you start to, there's kind of some stories about that maybe some very special people, they go up and they go live with God after they die, where everybody else just dies. And that's going to evolve, especially in Catholic thought, into this big distinction between heaven and hell, and that now in a later construct, everyone's going somewhere, and those somewheres really matter, and Sheol becomes hell, and heaven becomes much more open to human beings. Now you just have to be sort of a good person and do the things you're supposed to do, and everybody is going to go to heaven. And that, you bring that forward in time, and you start adding billions and billions of people to it, and heaven starts to seem like a really crowded place. So that's the modern construct is, well, it's not really your personality that's going to heaven. That wouldn't make sense. There's just too many people for that to be any kind of meaningful, sensible thing. So it can't be your personality that's going. It's just that essence of you is being reabsorbed into its creator. So the modern versions of it don't have aren't going to talk, aren't constructed in a way in which you'd have any kind of awareness of that heavenly experience, because your personality isn't there anymore. But that's still a good thing. So Hick's going to have that as a good thing. But again, and then that modern thinking is also letting go of hell as a construct. And the Catholic thought had this thing called purgatory. They had come up with along the way to try to mediate the extremes. And so what Hick's getting at is that there isn't really hell, although he'll call it hell, but it's just purgatory, what Catholics called purgatory. That so if you didn't learn enough by your soul making in your ordinary life experience, and then your personality via soul would go to this purgatory, him using traditional language, hell, and then you, with the purpose of learning more and growing morally, one supposes, and then that spirit would be absorbed into the divine kind of infinity. Now, what I think is a little bit difficult about how he's putting that all together is that the idea of universal salvation is meant to be a kind of reward. So everyone's going through these trials and tribulations, and then there is this kind of divine reward. And that's going to presumably compensate for that suffering, which is why he doesn't have the same emotional reaction that we do to this idea, is that he thinks that there's this compensation in the end. But if the construct of heaven is not really holding on to personality, then it's difficult to, I have a problem understanding how the reward actually is working, why he thinks that works the way it does, if you're not there to be aware, if it's not your personal awareness that's experiencing that. So it's I think, and again, remember that word postmodern, right? He's taking some ideas from some different strands and he's going to combine them, and in some ways they'll create an interesting picture that he thinks is kind of useful in a way, or might be pastorally useful to people. But if you're going to ask a lot of questions about it, what you start noticing are these strands that are coming from different places, and the strands themselves don't connect logically. They're being connected by him to paint a picture. And so the logic of that picture can kind of fall apart. So with enough picking at the details. And I think this is one of those details that I just don't see how this system can sustain itself on that point. But anyway, but keep in mind that that's where he's operating with this idea. There's going to be compensation. Everyone's put through this weird test. Some of them are going to suffer a lot more, but the point is to learn along the way, and everyone will eventually learn. And so even that satisfies in some ways our kind of sense of justice, which is lying behind these concepts of heaven and hell to begin with, that bad people should suffer. So his version of that is, well, their suffering is that it takes them much longer to go through this hell, really purgatory process. But in the end, those bad people will eventually recognize what they did and repent of it. And so that's meant to be pastorally reassuring to people that the evil is in some sense redeemed because the evildoers repent eventually. You won't know it, but God will. Okay. That makes sense? Any questions? All right.
Instrumental good is something that ultimately leads to goodness. And he thinks that the occurrence of pain, both as something that happens to you and something that you can do, leads us onto free will. We are capable then of making choices which work for us. So we can make choices. And these choices are ones that we are accountable for. The hope is, he thinks, that us as kind of severely kind of morally bankrupt human beings will hopefully make the right choices and reform ourselves, becoming good people. So this is where the instrumental good of pain really comes into its own. It is fundamentally the idea that pain will allow us to become individually good.
Right now, and also I guess keep in mind, if you take the scale problem out of the way, or at least set it aside for a second, this isn't exactly crazy, because this is really how we think about childhood in a lot of ways, that children can grow up and they grow up to be responsible adults, and along the way they have some bad experiences and they learn from those, and as parents we'll try and shield them as much as we can, but we can't completely. And so eventually, things happen to them. They fall down, they bump their knees, they'll have conflicts with their peers, but they're going to learn from those experiences. And so there is an intuition about how people grow that's built into this system that's not alien to us, because we apply it as we think about children growing up. But again, you got to take the scale issue out of it for that to really be for me to sell that idea. It can't be too extreme. But anyway, but there's something that's ordinary about this. I just wanted you to appreciate that point.
Richard,
Mhm.
what would he say about children who die young before they've been able to go through this process?
Mhm.
Well, I've not seen him address that specifically. I think, I mean, he's not Catholic, so he's not married to original sin quite the same way Catholics are. So, because there's one answer to that, which is that's well, I mean, the Catholics originally had this thing called limbo, which they gave up, but I think more that also would be a purgatory role, maybe that the soul of the child who dies too young to have grown enough would go to purgatory in order to do that little bit of growing they need to do. But one might expect, because they died innocent and young, there's not as much
Not a
growing
lot to
to
do.
do, maybe, or it's more easy to organize. I'm not. I think this is one of the problems with this kind of thinking, to be honest. So, yeah. But the
Well, the
logic that would be that's the only answer I could come up with and fit his system logically is they would have to go to purgatory.
It's just relying on so many things. I mean, I could imagine the ideal circumstance, you will have a personality built in, your psychological cognitive functioning that allows you to be somewhat resilient and so on. Then you have the right amount of pain and suffering, not too little, not too much. And then maybe you can really be, profiting from that. But if you throw in, you're being judged somehow on how far you've come with this, then, how is that fair, so to speak, to burden some people with incredible amounts of suffering, or other people who may have little suffering, but their personality structure is such that they are easily thrown off.
Well, and yeah, that's a version of the scale problem.
Yeah.
I think it's a problem for his system. Yeah, Jenna.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just also if individually you don't get the answer until after you're dead, then there's no motivation. So
Well,
I mean, that's that, but we haven't got to the criticism yet. So
Yeah.
I'm jumping at. But individually, to me, that's, if they don't know, so I'm being good, but maybe not good enough.
Well, that
Oh,
involves
yeah. How do you wouldn't know? Yeah, you don't. You have a problem of knowledge there. You don't know if it's good enough. What's good enough?
Yeah. So that I mean, so individually, that is where it doesn't quite hang together.
Yeah, I think for him, that's actually part of what he's after. Because he's seeing that as necessary for real growth. Is that you can't, if you had certainty, then you're not really growing into it as much. So you have to have certainty.
Yeah, okay, all right, I follow that now. Okay.
It's a feature, not a bug for him.
So doesn't Hick include an aspect where if you are doing the right thing and you're growing, that you can already, in a contemporary sense, right now experience like a union with whatever the beyond or something, the God, if you wish, or is that always a delayed thing, like linked to time? It's coming at a later moment.
No, I mean, he'd still, have the ordinary things about religious experience that people have and how they pursue their own spirituality and feelings of connection. So he'd have all that kind of,
that is still part of
more ordinary stuff for ordinary life. Yeah, that's part of his thinking. So that's still there. Yeah, Helena.
Well, does he then allow Jesus to die on the cross and the violence of it and the ugliness? What's good in it?
Well, that's okay. So, yeah, how they deal with some of this, that sort of, like
Did Jesus become
miracles? A lot of miracle stories they're willing to just give up on. Now, how would he? See, the process for the, I know for the process people, because I've had conversations about this. That's actually really, there's a significant problem for them because the whole system has a hard time dealing with the idea of Jesus as God dying for some purpose. So they often end up talking a lot more like Jesus is really just the greatest prophet in history, and the divinity will kind of drop away, except as it reflected in the fact that he's a prophet. But they do, I mean, when they're doing ordinary kind of stuff, they do try to talk about because these are the standard symbols in the system that you need to deal with as a Christian. So Hick in particular, that's a good.
Couldn't you see it though as part of this picture that on some level Jesus as the incarnation of God on earth, so to speak, represents the suffering part. He goes through the suffering. He in fact questions at some point why, and why do I have to go through this, or why can't this be taken from me? So there's an element of almost doubt in there too, in some, I think, in the gospel. But he dies because that's us. We can't get around aging, dying, suffering, and it's kind of sanctifying it in a way.
And that kind of stuff, that would make that that's okay. I mean, all of that fits coherently. It's I mean, what we're losing is this emphasis on original sin. That's been a big part of the tradition, but is especially part of the Catholic tradition. Helena, go ahead.
Well, he does say when he's hanging on the cross, why has God forsaken me?
Yeah.
And I would think that a lot of people think that right now.
Yeah, so you have Jesus as model. So that's useful.
That cross has become a very bad symbol. I'd rather have the tree of life.
Well,
the cross is not a good symbol.
Yeah, and originally the Christians were using the fish.
Yes.
Because it's Constantine who brings the cross because he's making it an imperial religion. It's really weird. It's this device for torturing people, and it's a strange symbol for a religion to use this device for torturing people as their primary symbol. And and people kind of forget that's exactly what they're looking at, but that's what it is. This is a tool for torturing people to death. Okay, anyway, you could get it. Modern people have quipped, the modern version of it, they should have an electric chair, so people will really know keep in mind what's really going on here. I'll have to think more about the Jesus angle. Anyway, let's see what else comes up.
Pain, essentially, and here's the kind of fundamental point. Pain is a veil of soul making. It allows us to develop into the people that God thinks we can become. And that, for Hick, is why God allows pain into the world. Now we're going to look at two main criticisms today. I think it might be best to start with this one, which is, of course, that he seems to have left something out, right? He seems to have left out animal suffering. No one knew animal suffering better than Charles Darwin. Darwin wrote this about animal suffering. He says that there is so much suffering in the world no one disputes. So obviously there is a lot of suffering. And some have explained this in reference to man. Now, obviously Darwin, coming before Hick, is not talking specifically about Hick, but this is a very popular thesis that pain provides the opportunity for choice and development. Hick calls it the minor report as opposed to the major report, which is kind of Augustine, but you know, this has been around since at least Irenaeus. So Darwin says, look, all of this evil and suffering could be explained and has often been explained in reference to man by imagining that it serves his moral improvement. Sound familiar? But the number of men in the world is nothing compared to that of other sentient beings. A sentient being is a being that is conscious, aware. And these, of course, are animals, suffer greatly without any moral improvement. The basic point is that animals suffer without the chance to morally improve. Darwin kind of noted this in reference to a whole load of things. This is from his autobiography, by the way. But he noted, for instance, there's a species of wasp that breeds by laying its larvae inside an alive, I think it's an alive caterpillar or a live maggot, and then those larvae grow and they eat their way out of the alive thing, digesting it slowly. What a horrible way to die. How, goes the criticism, can Hick explain that kind of suffering when it doesn't contribute to our development at all? Well, Hick does have a response to this. It was unfair of me a minute ago to say that Hick doesn't leaves it out. He doesn't leave it out. He does, in fact, respond. I'm going to put a little tick in for a response as opposed to the cross up there. Hick says, well, okay, partly he says he's not sure how much animals suffer, but we'll ignore that. He grants that invertebrates suffer. He grants that more complex animals suffer. But he says that this kind of suffering, animal suffering, he thinks is a survival mechanism.
Yes, I mean, he's a modern person, so he's going to be working with, you know, the full story of how the universe is created that we get from modern cosmology and how evolution works, and all of that's going to be part of the ordinary story that Hick's accepting. And it is important in that story that pain is there for evolutionary purposes, and if people, we know from medicine that there are people who occasionally who were born without pain responses for some reason, and they die very short, horrible lived lives because they keep doing things to themselves without realizing that they did something horrible to themselves. Like you imagine you break your leg and not know you broke it. You know, so people who don't have any pain don't live well. So pain is in a natural system, pain is there for evolutionary reasons. And so there you go. The animals are just got caught up in it, unfortunately, because humans had to evolve out of them somehow. That, I think, would be the shortcoming.
So in other words, if they didn't suffer, then they wouldn't know how to survive, because they wouldn't know what would hurt them and what wouldn't. He further, sorry, that was a squeaking table. Honest. He further says that animals actually lack the more what we might call existential kinds of suffering, the kinds of suffering that humans experience, like the knowing about death. So animals don't have psychological suffering in the same way. So they don't suffer from knowledge of mortality. They are essentially content until it's too late. Now, we might reply to this. We might say, hold on a second. Actually, animal suffering is huge. And the kind I've just described, like the wasp example, doesn't necessarily aid the survival of the creature being eaten.
See, there is power though in an evolutionary argument, because that is logically that really is all Hick has to do to go back to push back on this point is, yes, that's true, and it seems to be an unfortunate feature of how biology works in order for evolution to have happened, and so it's built into the system in a way that God couldn't do away with because it's necessary that it be there for everything to work, i.e. evolution to work. So I think it's, anyway, so this one I think is an interesting challenge, and it's a moral challenge. So you're pushing at the morality of the story he's telling. The story you're telling me, is this actually, am I ending up with something that's morally coherent to me? Can I believe this makes sense with a God that's good? And that would be where the argument's going is, okay, would a good God really do this? But that's just, again, it's a version of the scale problem. And if he already has his own harder versions of the scale problem. So this is just an easy version of the scale problem. So I don't think Hick would be moved by this. But also generationally, he's older and raised in a context in which he's not being taught to be sensitive to animal suffering in the way that children today have been raised to be much more conscious of that happens in the world. So it's, if he was born in a different generation, how would he nuance this differently? And I'm not sure, but I do think that those are kind of important features in how the argument's going.
It's a little bit like Hick's stopped the theodicy at humans. God cares not for animals, but that doesn't seem quite right. There's this quote from this is going to depress you, so I apologize, but there's this quote from Arthur Schopenhauer. He said that if you want to know whether the sum total of the earth is mainly pleasure or pain, all you need to do is consider one animal eating another one. In other words, like the one animal gets a meal, the other one is torn to pieces, and that's a lot more pain than the pleasure from the meal. Schopenhauer thinks that, if pleasure was the thing that you cared about instead of pain, then it would be better that there was no life on earth at all. That as he says, it would be better if the kind of the face of the earth were as arid as the face of the moon. I told you it depressed.
I have one quote that he has in mind. Schopenhauer, by the way, early 1800s, late, I think. Yeah, early 1800s, German. He's known for being pessimistic. Anyway, this quote is, "It would be better if there were nothing. Since there is more pain than pleasure on earth, every satisfaction is only transitory, creating new desires and new distresses, and the agony of the devoured animal is always far greater than the pleasure of the devourer." I'm not sure that's literally true, but it's pithy, to be sure. Schopenhauer, what a character.
Anyway, so that's animal suffering. It is immense. It's hard to explain. Here is Hick's explanation. Let's move on to one other objection. Now, this objection takes its aim here at this concept of free will. Okay, so the objection is this. It comes from J.L. Mackie, and he says,
We met Mackie earlier.
why could he God, of course, being omnipotent, capable of anything, not have made men such that they always freely choose the good? Couldn't he have made humans,
Mhm.
we always do the right thing? So couldn't God, being omnipotent, remember omnipotence being all powerful? So being omnipotent, all powerful,
I love this chalkboard of his.
create beings who, essentially this, right? Who exist in this space as things that could choose to do bad things. Let's imagine they have kind of two options, and one option is kind of the bad one, and one option is the good one. But they will always choose that. Now that doesn't sound like free will, right? But Mackie would argue it is. I mean, listen to this. I mean, would you consider ever murdering your grandma? No, right? Are you free and able to? Yes. Would you? No. You'd never choose that in that situation. Well, imagine that you were so disposed that you would never choose that in any situation, never a bad option in any situation. You could, but you never would. You would then be free, free will would exist, but there wouldn't be any need for pain. So God, in other words, for Mackie, kind of could have created a world without pain. Remember, Mackie is a supporter of the logical problem of evil, and he's dealing with the possibility of free will and pain existing in the same place. But Mackie's saying, actually, no, God could have created a world with free will and without pain. Now, Hick doesn't directly respond to this, but there is a part of Hick that might be useful here. So Hick does say this. He thinks that fundamentally, sorry, I was just going for, did you see that? I was just going for symmetry there. I'd underlined this one. I thought I haven't underlined that. Anyway, ignore me. Hick does say this in relation to free will and moral perfection, that it's important that we do it for ourselves. It's important to God that kind of moral goodness is attained. So through a journey. So we can't just be made good, because that's not worthwhile. Instead, we've got to go through the suffering in order to become good. Now, you may ask, in terms of that, why is that the case? Is that really the case? But I'll leave you to do that. So there are two criticisms.
And so, and one version of one way that I think this relates to is the same question of, well, why isn't God obvious to people? And the general answer has usually been sort of along these lines that, well, God has to be, can't be controlling in all of those ways. If God was obvious, that would have a controlling effect on us. So God can't be obvious. But Hick's problem is a little more than that, because he has this even greater distance that God's at from us in terms of this knowledge thing that he's talking about. And so it's sensible inside the logic of its own thinking, I guess, is the way to think about it. So if you imagine sort of you've adopted his project, part of what he wants to explain is things that we already know and accept about the world. And one of the things we already know accept about the world is that we do face these choices, we do have these challenges, we do have a potential to grow. And so logically, in terms of the system of an argument, he can just refer back to the fact that that's part of the world we know, and then shift it a little bit by saying, okay, why is that? Well, because it must be important to God that it be that way. Yeah, okay, but that just seems like kind of a logical circle. But in some sense, it has to be a logical circle, because the idea he's constructing has to be internally coherent. And so for it to be internally coherent, it has to reference itself in some ways that are going to accept sort of obvious claims from the world and then make some of its own claims about the world. But here it's anyway. My point is that from inside the system, it can seem a little bit easier to defend this with a small deflection. If you're kind of coming outside the system, challenging it, then it seems like this is a bigger challenge. And so the two sides are actually kind of thinking about this problem differently. He's making this outside challenge. Why can't God do that? And Hick's response is, that's not how the world works. So God didn't do it, obviously. But how does that prove anything? Well, it doesn't. It's just consistent inside his idea. Does that make sense? Remember, part of the game here is logical consistency. Okay.
Of Hick's theodicy. Could you have free beings who always do good things, and therefore there's no need for pain and suffering in the world? And also, what about the animals?
All right, there we go. Oh, let me make sure it's.
If you have a utility
Goes
meter
away
like
here,
this on
so
the
I don't
side of
hear
your house,
random
then I have
things.
some big news.
Okay. All right, so what are we thinking?
Well, so he didn't put up as the critique the scale issue, but it seems that that's in the book.
Mhm.
But I didn't. So I'm reading the critiques that seem to raise it, but I don't understand Hicks's response. Frankly, I keep rereading it. I'm not seeing how he responds to that. I mean, in part, he seems to say, oh, well, these horrors are human made, but is that the whole of his response? I feel like I'm missing something.
Well, yeah, you know,
My God.
he is relying on this universal salvation to be doing some of this, to be doing a lot of compensatory work. And so that's, I think that's what he's going to have to rely on in the end to solve the scale is eventually resolved because those who suffer are eventually rewarded.
Right, but then somewhere else, somebody says, okay, but this salvation is happening individually, but it's not consolidated in a way that makes the world better. Because his theodicy seemed to be individual based.
That's true. Yeah. I don't,
Okay.
for him, I'm not sure that's a problem. That's just a fact.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's how it's working. And so it may be that collectively we don't make much progress, but his point is individually, we're all eventually rewarded in the system for having gone through it.
That's funny, because then you just become an atheist. What else is there? And then you take responsibility for yourself and be good.
Well, right, yeah, no, see, they're all, they would all agree that that's an obvious conclusion to come to anyway, that you need to just make good decisions for yourself.
But
for
you know,
whatever you're doing.
it sort of captured my imagination, the notion of people always doing good. And there are people who never go out of their way to hurt other people or other animals.
Mhm.
And then I think of psychology sort of being the last science that we developed or attempted to understand. And what if we studied those humans that never do harm to others, to try to understand what is it that they're that way? You know, we study vigorously the other sciences and create wonderful gadgets and go to the moon and can, come in contact with a moving comet. But I just can imagine us studying to death human behavior. Well, that's a bad analogy, studying
No.
to death.
Right, but no, I get, yeah, I think I get your point. And we have a history of noticing such people, right? The Catholic Church calls them saints.
Mhm.
And people have reverence for the exemplars who stand out that way. And in a pre-scientific mode, that was our version of studying them, was to suppose that it's their devotion to their religion, that, and in a lot of cases, that's part of the story. Think about Gandhi. I mean, part of what made Gandhi is he's very devoted to his Hinduism.
Or what about the people who helped the Jews during the war at their own peril,
Yeah.
and I mean, they're not saints, but
Well, they are, but
well,
that's just
well,
it. They are.
I guess not officially saints,
No,
but
just
you're right.
unofficially, yeah.
You're right.
So, and there are organizations that are committed to trying to study this. I have been aware of at least two. One that has, there's somebody, and I'm forgetting the names, but endowed this foundation that just seeks out people who are selfless in the world. They just sort of do something that's remarkably selfless, and I think the point is and that it saves someone else. And they just have a pot of money, and they just give people money when they find them. Say, hey, look at that person. And the hope is, well, that they're rewarding them, by the foundation is doing good in the world. But the also hope is that by moving some money around, they'll attract a little attention, and that will also help by you paying attention to these people in the world.
I mean,
I would
I'm sorry.
definitely do good if I got paid. Absolutely.
but that's the thing. People do good without any reward whatsoever.
Yeah.
And along those lines, Kucinich was made fun of for wanting to create a position of a Department of Peace to study how to accomplish that. And it's in the same vein.
Yeah, and I think so that this actually is part of how a number of them will run up into the scale problem, and this is a lot of how they'll manage it is by calling attention to other features of the world that might lead us to question, well, how big a scale is it? So one other thing that this kind of view would want to point to is just that You know, if you think about how many people there are in the world, okay, how of those, what, it's almost, we're up to 8 something billion. How many of them are having a good day?
Today it's good.
So out of that 8 billion, how many having a bad day? And we do a lot of paying attention to that, because I think that's our moral intuition tells us we really should monitor bad things. So we notice that, you know, we notice that we might go through the news and try and figure out how many people are having a bad day, because those can be easy to point at. The more subtle bad days are harder. People are suffering psychologically, but we can point at those. But the problem is, what we're not noticing is, well, how small is that percentage of the total, you know, and how many people really are having a good day? And so yes, the bad things happen, but are we perhaps weighing them too heavily at times?
Well,
And
the other thing
this problem.
I heard is part of the reason the focus is on bad things is because they are rare.
Exactly. It's that's this point.
But can't we always also say, I mean, these saints and so on, they didn't live in the 21st century, and the world is so complex. And if you want to distinguish being the recipient of bad things and the ones that commit bad things, am I, when I go out and buy a piece of clothing that was made in Bangladesh in child labor, I might not know that, you know, and I am creating structures or participating in them. And sometimes I think for people who reasonably want to do the right thing, it's an overwhelming time, I think. Sometime when you think of, particularly those of us in industrialized nations, I mean, so much of what we do causes something else, somewhere else. And I don't know what the answer would be, how many people are having a good day, you know, would it be horrible to find out that number is decreasing over time?
It's also relative, isn't it? One person's good day could be another person's bad day, technically.
Yeah, no, the complexities of our world do make, that's a hard problem.
I heard sometime, like, you know, the people who live in monasteries or so on, and somebody was once quoted, they say, well, I don't know, if I lived and I had a mortgage and 2 kids and 2 cars and a college loan, how would I live this life that I'm living in contemplation and trying to, you know, realize the goodness in life and in myself. So
yeah, what do you know? Yeah, there's the wisdom of monastery life right there. Yeah.
all right.
So to go back to that saint question, was it Maimonides Richard, who said it's the best, highest level to give without anybody knowing you're so it's just the opposite.
Well, God knows.
Do it so we can find you and reward you.
Well, right, but see, in his system, God still knows. So that's part of the goodness of it. Is
right, but he's not giving out money. Sorry.
Well, God's giving out heaven, though.
Whomever is not giving out money, except in the afterlife.
That's right. But see,
but it was Maimonides. I just wanted to make sure I remembered that right. Okay.
Now, I think that's I think that's a kind of different point. Really, for him, the point is not that God's watching, it's just that ultimate goodness is not seeking reward.
Richard, is God evil?
Well, that's
this does raise the question of the dualities, the religions with the, you know, Manichaeism and Zoroastrianism. There definitely is an evil God and a good God, and right, and they battle it out. Well,
in okay, there's a subtler, a more ordinary version to refer to too, which the Jewish construct of that is your Yetzer, you know, that you have a good Yetzer and an evil Yetzer, and which is a nature, a good nature and a bad nature. And so which one are you following? And so it's sort of up to you to choose that. Am I going to follow the good side of me, or am I going to follow the bad side of me? Islam kind of tries to make that a little more physical by imagining you have these angels, which is where that comes from, right? The good angel and the bad angel. That's from Islam. So and which they're getting from Judaism, from the Yetzer. It's so.
But Richard, I'm studying the Old Testament, and I
Yeah.
think that God is very cranky.
Well, cranky, yes.
He's always cranky, and he tells people what to do. It's almost Trumpian.
Yeah.
You do what-
Yeah, and it's hard with subtleties. Like, you know, maybe there are good people in the midst of the bad people. Struggles with that. Abraham had to argue with him about that with
What was it?
Sodom and Gomorrah, right?
Yeah.
But can we say about Hick that he actually thought that you could apply those labels of good or evil? It seems like in the critique by David Griffin, he quotes Hick to say, it cannot be said of the ultimate reality to be one or many person or thing, substance or process, good or evil, purposive or non-purposive. So is it
What page are you looking at?
in my new version 53, kind of close to the middle in the critique of Hick by, maybe I misunderstood that. I guess I'm just kind of interested, is one of the things that might come up with Hick or others, the idea that we're spinning our wheels trying to use these words, good and evil, or apply them. These are in our frame of reference as humans, born in the concept of time, and can we apply that to a divinity or whatever?
I think that's what I think Hick has in mind, and Griffin is just rejecting that. But that is an idea that Roth would agree with, right? Mm-hmm. That's the whole point, you know, the good and bad are in our constructs, and God might have different, you know, kind of understandings of good and evil. So I think, Hick is left with something like that. And it is, I mean, and that does make some sense because he does have the kind of postmodern and construction that he's working with, and so it makes sense that Roth, having the same kind of postmodern construct, that the two of them would be having to pick up the same point because it's logically related to how they're thinking. Yeah, I mean, the rest of that sentence is kind of the complicated German philosophy that goes into theology, but you know, about in itself, and that to say that something is one thing is a curiously complicated claim to make in philosophy, but it gets into metaphysics, and here, so here it's a matter of that even God is difficult to pin down that way. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, and that's the one that's kind of the strong point that we'll get both from Stevens and from Griffin is that they're not relying on any kind of postmodern construct to put their ideas together. Anyway, it looks like we've run out of time, so we'll let's see, what is that? I think Stephen is next. Check the yeah, so it's Davis. will be next. So again, so the one, this one with the he calls, the chapter he calls Free Will and Evil, that's going to be very much like the classical Augustinian version of Theodicy. So you've heard a little bit about that, and I'll bring some more of that in order to talk about what Davis is up to with his version of this. All righty. Y'all have a good week.
I wish Paul had some humor.
I will work on the recordings.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you later.